Okay.
Okay.
I'm Stephen Dow. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Amy Zhang. Amy is actually technically right now a postdoc at Stanford. She just finished her PhD at MIT in computer science, and she's already got a job lined up as an assistant professor at UW in their, is this in the computer science and engineering? Yeah, so computer science all the way. And Amy's done a lot of really great system work around online discussions and civic deliberation, and I think she's going to have a lot of cool insights for us to learn about. So with that, welcome, Amy.
Thank you, and thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be back here. Okay, so I'm going to get started. All right, so when you think about online discussion today, what kinds of things come to mind? What do you think about when you think about the state of online discourse? Any trolling? Okay. Yeah, so this is like, sometimes when I open my Twitter, when I open my email, certain days, not every day, but certain days, this is kind of what I feel like doing, right? The state of online discourse is not great today. But not everything on the internet makes me want to throw my laptop out the window, right? Actually, there are a lot of really great things about the internet. If you step back and think about it, it's actually kind of amazing how many things we're able to do now collectively that we just couldn't do like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, thanks to all these digital tools, the internet itself, search, etc. So what is it about online discussion where it seems like things have not gotten better over time? In fact, things seem to have perhaps gotten worse over time. So I'll go through a couple of quick examples just in case you're not convinced. This popped up in my feed earlier this year, and I was like, oh my God, I gotta read this. So the term email overload was actually coined back in 1995. And as you can see, we are still dealing with the issue today. Besides just the number of messages that we're getting, that's kind of like inundating us, we're also drowning in the number of places where discussion occurs, right? So maybe your mental model of your different discussion tools looks a little bit like this. I know mine does. Speaking of things like Slack, just a few years ago, people were like, oh, wow, there's this new thing called Slack. It's going to kill email. It's going to solve all of our problems. Unfortunately, email is as alive as ever. I'm sure you can all attest. But we have this new problem, and it's called Slack overload. Here's another article headline that I would say kind of nicely encapsulates some of the problems and some of the general sentiment around online discussion today. Trash fire. And I would say this is actually kind of an optimistic headline because I think we can all agree that things haven't really gotten better since 2016, right? So fed up with dealing with these problems, a lot of systems out there have chosen to actually close down their comment sites. So things like Popular Science, NPR, The Atlantic have just thrown up their hands and said, this is too big of a problem for us to handle. Speaking of big problems, it's gotten so bad now that people are actually blaming our systems of online discourse for these terrible things like bringing about the downfall of democracy. It's a really bad problem. And here's an example of that sort of playing out in people's opinions. So when we take a step back, what sort of problems are we still grappling with today when it comes to online discussion that are still around and maybe have even perhaps gotten worse over time? So one of these is scale. Discussions everywhere are just too long for anyone to read. This leads to all sorts of down-the-road issues. So this here is actually a screenshot that I took of a talk page on Wikipedia, so the place where Wikipedians are talking about what to put on the Wikipedia page. This is a talk page about the Wikipedia page for Jane Austen, and they are arguing about citations, I think, on the Jane Austen page, and as you can see, it's getting really out of hand. This is just so much to read. This was a problem in the 90s. It is becoming worse now because it's happening everywhere. Thousands of comments, thousands of replies. We have made it so easy to talk and to amplify discussion, but how easy is it to actually listen to that discussion? Another huge problem is this issue of all these different types of people and behavior that you have coexisting on the same platform and causing issues, causing tension. So anything from simmering tensions, people with different behaviors on the same platform. For instance, someone who posts too many memes in your group text message or something and being really annoying about that, escalating to things like bickering, escalating to things like polarization between sides. Then we get into bigger issues like bad actors riling things up on platforms and trolling each other. Finally, we have these major issues playing out today, such as misinformation and disinformation campaigns on social media, as well as large harassment campaigns harassing people off of the major platforms. So before I go any further, I just want to say, this is so far away from the original vision of the internet, right? This is not what it was supposed to be about. It was supposed to be about democratizing communication, which, that kind of happened, but certainly not in a way that is more humane or fair. So not in a way that really respects our human values and our human needs. So what happened to that original vision? Why isn't online discussion getting better? All these other things have gotten better, so what is it about online discussion? So I argue that there's a couple of things here. First, our systems of online discussion have evolved rapidly in the ways that we can author content and amplify content. Right? So now we have an unprecedented ability to write something and have that get shared around the world. And platforms have also really dedicated themselves to making it really easy for people to share content and also building more and more high-powered authoring tools to be able to add media and add filters and all these different things. But these are for authoring content. But the thing that hasn't kept up with this power to speak is the power to actually curate what you see, right? So once everybody has a microphone, the fact that you have a microphone is not all that useful. What's actually useful is the ability to understand all the things that are coming at you from everyone's microphones, right? And right now, our tools are just not able to do that for us, and we're not able to do that with our tools. So not only is it important to be able to do that individually, for myself, for my own information, but it can also be really powerful to curate information collectively, right? So when you think back to all the great advances that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, things like Wikipedia or the internet itself, what made them really powerful was that they got better over time because they let people build on each other's work, right? So think back to the last time you went digging through a forum to find a particular piece of information. Or maybe you wanted to fact check something that someone said. First of all, it was probably kind of cumbersome to just do that for yourself. And second of all, once you did it, your work disappeared, right? There was no way for anyone to actually build on what you did. And then the last thing I want to say is, okay, so say you had the ability to do all these cool, fancy curations on top of discussion. Now think about how our discussion tools could look and act differently with that curation, right? Today, if you think about the tools you actually use for online discussion, things like email or chat or forums, they haven't really changed in a very long time. So when it comes to their basic structure, email is still email. Maybe at one point, people used IRC. Now they are using Slack. Perhaps at one point, you may have used PHP-BB to talk with each other on forums, and now you're using something like Discourse or Reddit. Okay, so some things have changed. I think we can all agree that the usability and the UX and design of these tools have gotten better. However, the functionality and the structure of these systems haven't really changed much, right? Okay, so now you have things like upvotes, but that kind of just moves things on the page a little bit. You also have things like social media, which has this something like a forum structure, but it's overlaid on top of a social network. But other than those kind of two small bits of curation, these systems haven't really changed that much in decades. So what I argue then is, in order to improve online discussion, we need new tools that actually give people the power to be able to add the structured information that they find important, to be able to collectively curate and build on each other and actually improve their discussions and their discussion environments to tailor to themselves. And so that's what I worked on during my PhD. So I worked on building tools that could demonstrate these possibilities for collective curation in online discourse. And I focused on these two major goals, and then tried to build systems that sort of achieve these goals of collective curation in a couple different domains. So the first of these is summarization of discussions. And this is, again, tackling this issue of things being too large, too long to read. How can we tackle scale by collectively boiling down a large discussion so that it's easy for new readers to then explore that discussion? And I've looked at this in the space of kind of asynchronous discussion threads as well as the space of group chat. The second thing is giving users that have these different competing norms and behaviors on the same platform the ability to more finely control what content they get and to whom they send and how they get. So basically different forms of fine-grained moderation. And here I'm looking at giving users more control in the context of email, particularly mailing lists, and then also the specific case of online harassment. So a little bit about my research method. First, and this is the process I do with pretty much all of my projects. First, there's some sort of formative need finding where I'm going out, I'm interviewing people, I'm conducting surveys, or I'm doing a large-scale data analysis to understand the problems that people are having with online discussion. Then I try to build a system to solve some of those problems. And then I deploy that system to specific communities and do field tests or in-the-wild studies to see how they're actually used in real settings. That informs my understanding of the problem in the systems, and then it kind of goes around in a loop. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about dealing with large discussions using summarization. And in the systems I build, I focus on two main aspects. So first is this idea of the production of summaries, or how can people effectively collaborate to summarize a discussion down. Then the second part is the design of that final summary artifact, right? So how can we actually design something that actually helps newcomers get caught up? And first I'll talk about forums. So I've already told you about how forums are this big and unwieldy mess. And we know this is difficult to comprehend. You can just tell by looking at it. But there are some upsides. There's a reason why we'll go digging through these sometimes. And it's because they contain people's original voices and they contain different perspectives that are valuable. So when we think about something like summarizing a large discussion, it would be kind of nice to be able to perhaps go back and forth between these two different modes, where on the right hand, or I guess on your left-hand side, we have wikis, where a wiki is, on Wikipedia, for instance, it has no personality, which is, I guess, bad, but it is neutral, it is short, and it's easy to read. So instead of having one or the other, wouldn't it be great to be able to just go back and forth between the two? And there have been some systems that have tried this. So this is a feature on Quora called Answer Wikis. So actually what they did was, I don't know if you've seen this in the wild, but they popped up a wiki text box on top of the answers on a certain number of question and answer threads where people could collaboratively summarize the answers that come below. But there's a problem with just kind of like mashing these two systems and just putting them next to each other. Right? So the big problem here is that these two things are completely disconnected, right? So I can't tell if an answer summary is actually complete. If I'm interested in a particular part of the answer summary, there's no way for me to know from which answer below it actually came from. So these two things are actually completely disconnected. So to solve these problems, we developed this tool. It is called Wickham. It takes the word wiki and form and puts it together. And you can play with it at wickham.org. So it's kind of like a pictorial representation of how it works. So first, say you have a discussion. And there's a lot of back and forth. Once it's over, you've got this big mess of threads, all these different little sub-threads, right? This happens a lot. So then to boil down a large discussion, we developed this crowdsourcing method called recursive summarization. The idea is that, very simple, anyone can grab a small section of discussion and just summarize that section. And then another small subsection of the discussion can be grabbed by the same person or a different person and be summarized. And so on and so forth. And then the summaries can also be summarized themselves. So that's the kind of the recursive element. And you keep going until the entire discussion is summarized. Right? And what you get when you summarize a discussion this way, when you have this method of production, is that you actually have this interesting artifact at the end, which I call a summary tree. Basically, this is an explorable, interactive artifact, right? So I can either read at a high level the summary of the discussion, or I can dive into a deeper level summary and dive all the way back to the original discussion if I'm interested in understanding people's original voices. And yeah, it's interactive, as you can see. OK, so I'm going to show a video of the actual Wickham tool in action. To explain the context, a couple years ago participated in this 2-week civic tech event in Madrid, where they have this tool called Decide Madrid. Basically, people in the city can make proposals and discuss proposals to the city. And if it gets to a certain level, the city officials actually have to vote on it. So it's kind of a pretty cool system. But as you can see here, we've got 835 comments on this Madrid 100% sustainable proposal. And in fact, we interviewed some city officials when I was over in Madrid, and they said that they did not read any of the comments in these forums because they just didn't have time. So, wouldn't it be useful, perhaps, to actually collect this information from these forums and be able to make use of it? So here's the tool. There's sort of like a visual, interactive visualization of the tool of the discussion on the left. The blue nodes are the original comments. The dark orange is the summary. As you can see, the summaries are kind of embedded in the original discussion threads. Here I am, perhaps, I grabbed a short sub-discussion and have summarized it. I can cite a particular comment. And now for the next reader, they'll come in, they'll see that summary that's embedded in the discussion, and they can choose whether or not they want to expand and read the original context. And I didn't show in this video, but there's also features for tagging and for clustering similar comments together and sort of grabbing them as a group and summarizing them together. OK. So we did an evaluation of Wickham, comparing it to Google Docs to kind of simulate a wiki environment, where we had users in our user study added in sequence to different groups. And each new user in a group was asked to advance the summary of a discussion in Wickham and in Google Docs from where the last person in the group had left off. So as you can see here, the solid lines are the people doing the Wickham summaries, and then the dashed lines are the Google Docs. And you can see, even with the same group of people, so the lines with the same color, Wickham was faster in all three. And in fact, we noticed that the productivity kind of, it did OK in the Google Docs version, and then it kind of stalled after a little while. And we were curious as to why that happened. And we found the reason why was that people were actually, and this has been shown in other work as well, but people are really reluctant to edit each other's work. So what they did in the Google Docs case was they actually continued kind of appending their partial summary to the prior person's partial summary, which was OK, that's working at first, but then no one was actually working to condense that down further, and then you ended up with this summary that was as long as the original discussion. And this was not a problem in the Wickham case because nothing is ever actually destroyed in Wickham. It just gets overlaid on top of each other. We had also done an evaluation of these summary tree artifacts where we asked new people to explore discussion using these summary trees. we found that people were more able to kind of accurately remember points in the discussion using the Wickham summaries versus using the Google Docs summaries that have been created. And here one person is talking a bit about this benefit in Wickham of being able to directly link these partial summaries to exactly what they're summarizing. So in the last year, we've been collaborating with the Wikimedia Foundation on using Wickham to summarize discussions that happen in Wikipedia. Now, of course, Wikipedia is a place where there are a lot of these really, really long discussions. And we actually did a study here where we went out and we looked at all these large discussions that are happening on Wikipedia. So the way it works is when you cannot come to an agreement via editing, you hop over to the talk page and you have a really long discussion and you invite outside people to come in and participate in this deliberation about what to do. And then after that's over, a new person who's unaffiliated comes in and reads, understands the entire discussion, writes a summary of it, and then makes a resolution. When we looked at all the discussions on Wikipedia where this had happened over the last 7 years, actually an entire third of them were never resolved. Basically, people would have the discussion and then it would just die. And part of the reason why, when we interview people who do this kind of summarizing work a lot, is that it's just too hard. Like, people said that they would spend hours just reading a discussion. I mean, that is a lot of time. So we're thinking about, okay, could perhaps people use Wickham to make this process easier? And then also, could they use Wickham to make it more collaborative? Because right now, it's just one person doing it, no matter how long that discussion is getting. As I kind of alluded to earlier, I think there's a really nice use case for Wickham and these kinds of like citizen democracy initiatives. So one aspect I didn't really talk about, but I'm interested in exploring, is how this act of collaborative summarization is also a form of listening and a form of reflection, which could be a useful mechanism for getting citizens on the same page. Okay, there's the tool. So after building Wickham, I started to think about this question of summarization, but in the context of group chat. And I was wondering first whether any of the problems that people were facing in asynchronous discussion also happened in group chat. And we did some formative interviews with people who do use group chat a lot, and we found that there is this big problem, which is you go away for an hour a day, maybe on vacation, and you come back to these long streams of missed messages. And we found that basically the only thing people could do to catch up was to scroll up in their viewport until they got tired. Like, that's all you could do. And you can see why this is so difficult, right? You're scrolling and there's all this chatter and that you have to weed through, and it's really difficult to distinguish what is important from what is not important, right? So just to try and make some headway on this problem, I thought about just like lightweight ways that participants in a chat conversation could signal and collaboratively signal things that are happening in the conversation as it's going on. So imagine you could mark up a chat log as you're creating it with like, oh, a new topic of conversation has started. I'm just going to mark that. Or an important idea was mentioned here. Or here is a question and it led to this answer, right? And the great thing about having this kind of rich markup over a chat discussion is that you can now do things with it. For instance, you could automatically generate a summary of the chat discussion that pulls from these signals for new people to, or people who haven't read the discussion to look at instead of having to scroll. So then a question is, what kinds of signals, right? What kind of signals do people want from their chat? Another question that we had was, what format should that final summary be in? And we built a number of different prototype summary views, I guess, kind of exploring different things that are out there today. So on one hand, you could have an abstractive summary. This is sort of like a nicely written encapsulation of the discussion that happened. And this would be something that someone has manually written. Another could be extractive. It could be done by people or machines, but taking out specific messages in the chat log that were deemed important. And Slack has a feature like this called Slack Highlights. Another could be discourse acts. So maybe you could be tagging these different messages that you're extracting with their particular function. For instance, whether it was an update or a resource, for instance. Another could be a more high-level approach that is just trying to show you some summary statistics. So like how many messages, what were the main topics, who are the main participants, that kind of thing. So we showed these to a bunch of people, and we got the feedback first that people really wanted structure. They wanted something that was easy to skim. So actually, the summary that was the hardest to create turned out to be least favored amongst our prototypes. And the issue was that this sort of like block of text, even though it's small, is difficult to skim. Another thing that we heard was that people wanted context, right? So as a result, things like extractive summaries were also not very favored because it was incredibly hard to figure out the context of these messages, right? So in the end, actually, the design prototypes of the discourse acts and the high-level signals were the most liked amongst all of our participants. So from these insights, we built this tool. It is called Tilde, coming from kind of the phrase tilde, too long, didn't read. And our logo is a tilde. And you can play with it and actually install it in your Slack if you want, at this website called tildechat.com. And the way it works is there's basically two ways to mark up a chat log as it's ongoing. So one is by using emoji reactions to actually tag a message. So you can see how that works there. Another is this feature in Slack where you can add slash commands. You add a slash and then these different commands pop up, and then you can sort of use that to annotate your note that you're adding to the chat. And then in terms of what to tag, we had a number of possible tags corresponding to like discourse acts and some other conversational signals that people were really interested in. So I'm going to show a video of the tool in action. Okay, so say I am having a discussion in Slack. And I'm conversing with someone about something, and then a new topic of conversation comes up, and so my friend adds the topic top emoji to signal that a new conversation has started. We're talking, it's not very important, but at some point something important happens where we make a decision. And so then I can add an emoji reaction to this decision, which is like the handshake emoji for decision. And that gets added to an ongoing list of summary notes. So you can kind of see the status of the summary as it's ongoing. Don't need to look at all these GIFs that are passing by. You can also add a note using slash commands, like I mentioned. So also you can link notes to other notes. So here I'm linking an answer to a question. Inline emojis also work. Since a lot of our users were interested in this in a work context, you can actually assign notes to other people as well. And the great thing is, once this is over, someone else who wasn't in the conversation comes back from being away. Instead of having to scroll up and kind of like piece in reverse chronological order what happened, they can just go to another channel, perhaps where these summaries are being posted, and see the notes that people have left behind for them. And they're also linked. So, if one note is particularly interesting, I can click in, see where that note happened, scroll around, understand greater context, and then get caught up. Okay, so I won't go into detail here, but we did a bunch of lab evaluations, comparing it to like taking notes in Google Doc while using Slack or just using Slack by itself. But more exciting for me was we deployed this to a couple of different small companies / groups. So one was a small startup, tech startup. Second was another tech startup that was actually fully remote. So they did all their social activity on Slack. And then in addition, a sort of small lab research group and a kind of like editorial newsroom group that used Slack. And overall, we were surprised that people were extremely active using our tool. In fact, at some point, people were adding so many sort of notes and summaries that one of the managers came to me and was like, people are adding too many notes. Like, this is too much for me to read in order to like catch up. And it's like, okay, maybe we need summaries of the summaries now. Like, but people also gave some really enthusiastic feedback. Okay, so you can try out the tool there. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to tools that look at how to give people the ability to configure more finely how messages get delivered. So in a lot of systems today, actually, if you think about it, there aren't that many controls to be able to say, like, hey, I want to get this message, or I don't want to get this kind of message, or I want to send to these people, but not to these people. I don't want this to go viral, these kinds of things. One really clear example of this is the mailing list. If you think about it, it's actually crazy because mailing lists have basically not changed in the 40 years or so that they've existed. And this is like what life was like 40 years ago. And yet everybody still uses them, right? Like we all are on like mailing lists. And it's not like there aren't other options out there today, right? So nowadays you can start a Facebook group, you can set up a forum, you can have a subreddit. Unfortunately, we did a study. We asked people, we did some interviews with 20 people, then we did a really large-scale survey with around 400 people, and we asked people why they still like mailing lists and whether they would switch. Most people said that they would not switch. And these were some of the main reasons. So things like people think email is more likely to be read than social media. Email delivery is more customizable than social media. Email feels more private than social media. And these kind of help us give indications of like, oh, if we were trying to build something better, these are the things we would want to keep intact. However, it's interesting, some of these things were actually wrong. So a lot of the people that we interviewed from one mailing list said this about their mailing list. It turned out their archives were completely public. So anyone in the world could go see their emails, but they didn't know that. There are also downsides to mailing lists. Don't know if you've been following some of the like drama that's been happening at MIT recently, but we have this mailing list for our lab called CSAIL, which is called CSAIL Related, and there's this person on CSAIL Related named Richard Stallman who has been sort of like a resident troll on the mailing list for like decades. And it's actually a true story that the problem of him being on our mailing list motivated me to do this project. Anyway, so problems with mailing lists, right? So we found lots and lots of cases where people wanted to participate in this discussion, but they were really afraid of posting. People also had very different ideas about what is acceptable content and what is the acceptable quantity of posting on a mailing list, and this led to different tensions. Exacerbating these tensions, people actually access their emails in very different ways. So things like somebody who filters their mailing list to a special mailing list folder were like, oh, like people are filtering this anyway, so it's fine if I just like spam the list one more time with like my announcement. Versus people who did not filter their mailing list and we're getting them all in one inbox. We're like, oh, I can't send this email to this mailing list. It's gonna like be such a problem in all these people's inboxes. I'm going to waste all their time. So very different ideas as a result of that. So one of actually the first projects during my PhD was on this concept of like reimagining the mailing list to try to deal with these cons but leave some of the pros, right? So to do that, we thought of ways that we could introduce more controls into the mailing list. So within a mailing list, you can do things like follow or block specific people, follow or block specific topics, tag emails with topics, things like I want to get the I want to get the first message in a thread, but I don't want to get any of the replies unless I choose to subscribe to that thread. So like little fine-grained things like that, and being able to do all of this from your inbox as opposed to from whatever site that you have to go to. So the tool's been in active use by the public for the last 3 or so years, and still planning like new features and kind of like longitudinal experiments with it. Okay, and then finally I want to talk about online harassment. So it was actually working on the mailing list project that we had this idea that this type of system for fine-grained controls could potentially be a useful way for helping people deal with online harassment, right? And this is this case where you're getting these messages that are kind of designed to hurt you in some way. So either they're emotionally painful, or people are basically trying to do like a denial of service attack on your inbox so you can't access your regular messages. But in both cases, you kind of feel like you've lost control of your inbox. And so we wanted to understand how people are experiencing this, since none of us had been harassed before. And so we wanted to interview people that had been harassed. Turns out they come from all walks of life, just anywhere from like teachers and journalists and activists down to like people dealing with like an ex-partner. So all sorts of things. And then we found two really interesting things that kind of came out from all of our interviews. So one was that people get harassed in very different ways. They have really, really different ideas about what is harassment to them, and also really different ideas about how they would like to deal with harassment. And the second thing that was really interesting was that the most effective strategy for people after just deleting their account and disappearing, which is not something we want to happen, was to actually give a password to their friend and then have that friend go in and clean up their inbox for them. So we thought this was really interesting. Here's one person who talked about how they did that. This isn't really how you're supposed to use passwords, so maybe there's a way to design a system that actually supports this behavior instead of it being kind of a hack. So from these insights, we built this tool called Squadbox. It's a tool to help people fight harassment. And it has two main ideas. So one is this idea of friend-sourced moderation, so kind of like what I was talking about. So right now, say you're getting inundated with a stream of messages coming to you. Once that happens, you can flip a switch, turn on Squadbox, which turns on a set of filters that sends things that are likely to be harassing to a set of trusted friends who can then do with it sort of as you direct them to do. That wasn't the entire picture, and this is sort of a more detailed look of how it works. And here, all I want to emphasize is this issue or this concept of like flexible configuration. Since people had such different ideas about what is harassment, how to deal with it, we wanted it to be really flexible to be able to handle different needs. So, some people wanted to actually see their harassment after it happened. Some people just wanted it to disappear. Some people wanted to save certain things in order to report them, or wanted to be notified right away if they're like being doxxed or something. So all these different configurations that we added to the tool. So we did a short field study of Squadbox, found some interesting things. One was that over time, both the owners of the Squadbox, so the people that were getting harassed, and their moderators got less nervous over the course of the study about privacy violations. So that was interesting. Another was that owners felt more guilty, and moderators got kind of more worried that they weren't doing a good enough job over the course of the study, even though the owners were really, really happy and thought they were doing a really great job. So this suggests perhaps some like follow-on work to support relationships and relationship maintenance in the tool. So I just want to quickly mention some of the feedback we've gotten from this tool. We've demoed it to a number of people. Here we were talking to someone who is a friend of someone who was getting harassed, and clearly demonstrating a desire to help, but not knowing how to help. So, okay, in summary, my research has been on reimagining these kinds of new structures of online discussion systems to give users the power to be able to do things to curate discussions, such as summarize large discussions or configure the delivery of discussions. So really quickly, I'm going to go over some of the design takeaways and some of the areas for future research that I think are really interesting. So one of the things that I explored in this work, and maybe you can kind of see it across the different systems, is these ways of adding structure to discourse, where the structure is actually superimposed over the underlying kind of like raw structure of the discussion, which is like replies and threads and that kind of thing. So instead of sort of saying at the outset, I want to have discussions look and act a certain way, I say, okay, have the discussion the way you want, but we're going to add some things on top that let people sort of curate the way that it acts. And this was for a couple of reasons, right? So one was finding that people are afraid of editing each other's work, right? So maybe overlaying it is not so bad. Also, having this overlay means that we can now establish this provenance between this summary artifact and the actual underlying discussion that's happening underneath. So you can always get back to the raw material if you want to. And then this concept of having more incremental forms of formalism. So first starting with just kind of like unstructured whatever, and then kind of gradually adding imposed formalism as you go, as needed, right? So not everything in the world has to be summarized. Some things do, and so maybe you can just summarize those parts. I've also been thinking about moderation and governance kind of more broadly. So right now, you have this continuum, right? So on one hand, you have user moderation, which is, I, for myself, can block, follow, mute specific people or topics, etc. On the other side, you have platform moderation. The platform can unilaterally ban stuff, remove stuff, sort the algorithm, like change the algorithm in different ways, and it affects everyone. And I think there's this really interesting area in the middle. I'm going to call it networked moderation. Squadbox is one example of this. I would say another could be like Twitter block lists, if you're aware of what that is. It's basically people collaborating on who to block on Twitter. And really, with harassment, it's this case where on the one hand, maybe the platform isn't stepping up to the plate, or maybe you don't actually want them to be moderating some of these more contextual issues of harassment. On the other hand, it's just too much for one person to have to deal with on their own. So are there ways that people can leverage their local community, their network, to help them in these situations? I think that another area where this is really relevant is the issue of misinformation, actually. So here again, maybe it's something where you don't really want the Facebook of the world, like deciding what is and isn't true for everybody. On the other hand, maybe it's just too much for me to go out and fact check everything that I see online. That's just a lot of work. So, are there structures where maybe I can designate people I trust, my friends, or specific journalists or specific fact-checking groups, and sort of follow the fact checks or whatever that they provide to me. And so this is some of the work that I've been doing with this group called the Credibility Coalition that's looking at sort of research and open standards for collaborating on misinformation. And then finally, just a little bit about sort of like some of the stuff I've been thinking about at Stanford. So the networked moderation piece is one area I'm really interested in. Another one is this concept of like community resilience. So resilience, not just to outside bad actors, so like trolls or like, I don't know, like infiltrators, but also like internal resilience, so being able to recover from crisis moments and that sort of thing. So, when a community encounters a crisis moment, like what's actually causing it and what can we do about it, right? So right now, when your computer has a virus and you can turn on safety mode and then go in and sort of do various things to try and restore your computer. There's really no concept for like a community, right? Like right now you can either just like shut the whole thing off and nobody can talk, or just have things continue on as they're continuing. But maybe there are things you can do. Like for instance, you could say like people are getting really heated over this conversation. I'm going to turn on quiet mode or reflect mode, and people have to like wait 5 minutes before they can reply to anybody, like things like that. And then you can turn that off once things have calmed down. These kinds of ideas, and just kind of other ways you could allow communities to kind of rapidly iterate on governance structures, and perhaps even just like fork the governance of other communities. So like this community is managed really well. Like, can I copy some of the stuff that they're doing over to mine? Another thing I'm thinking about is this issue of like human curation versus algorithmic curation, right? So, as you're listening to me talk about this work, maybe you're thinking like, why can't we just solve all this with algorithms, right? And what I would say to that is, okay, first off, algorithms kind of currently aren't good enough in their current state. And the ways in which they're not good enough actually leads to more problems, right? So things like clickbait and misinformation are partially due to some of the algorithms we have for amplifying engagement on our social platforms. And the reason for that is that the signals that these algorithms are being trained on are extremely shallow. They're things like likes and clicks, right? So I do think that there is a future for including algorithmic curation, but it first starts with users and users providing richer metadata, richer contextual information to these algorithms, to these systems, to actually tell the system what they actually want. So as one example, I've done some work on identifying different discussion structures in threaded discourse. So like a question answering discussion here versus a back and forth debate over here. This is a project I did on top of Twitter, not Twitter, this is on top of Reddit, but I did the work at Google. And once you have this kind of information about what kind of discussion a discussion is, you could do some really useful things. So for instance, if you're trying to summarize a discussion, maybe you want to summarize a Q&A discussion in a very different way than you want to summarize a back and forth debate, right? Like in a Q&A discussion, you want a summary of the answers. In a debate, you want the pros and the cons, right? So this lends itself to probably very different machine learning models for these different kinds of contexts. So I think we need some understanding of that first. And then looking forward, I'm definitely interested in thinking about moderation and governance of these large social platforms, how in the future we're going to have to combine both human and AI efforts in a mindful way that actually respects user autonomy. So one project that I've been thinking about this is actually alternative governance structures for communities, right? So a lot of the time nowadays in a community, you have admins and mods, and that's basically like an autocracy, right? So what are more democratic forms, right? Here we were thinking, okay, what about juries? You know, we have juries in the American legal system. What could that look like for content moderation? And could that be more democratically legitimate? You know, I don't know if you heard the news, but like Facebook is now creating basically a Supreme Court to look at moderation, like really tough moderation decisions. So, you know, if we're going to have a Supreme Court, why not juries, right? Okay, so to wrap up, just a quick reminder of where we were not that long ago. This is Tim Berners-Lee. He said, the fact that we're all connected does change the parameters, but I think in general, it's clear that most bad things come from misunderstanding, and communication is generally the way to resolve misunderstandings. The web is a form of communication, so it generally should be good. So I think a lot has changed. Even in the course of me starting this work back in 2014, this topic has shifted a lot, and the thinking around this has really shifted a lot. And it's shown us how this perspective is actually kind of like dead wrong. So I hope through this research that we can kind of get past our current state right now. So we're, as I mentioned in the beginning, not in a great state. And we can put out these fires of like misinformation and like harassment. But beyond kind of putting out fires, I'm really interested in thinking about how online discourse could actually be a force for good, right? So how does things like education or work or collaboration improve with online discourse? And how can tools help us realize that positive vision? Okay, so that's it, and I'll take any questions now.